All right, Module 3, we're heading into the back half of the course. Now, this module is going to be a little bit different than the other ones we've done. It builds on Module 2 in particular, but what I wanted to do is to deep dive on a particular and single issue, and then also offer you an opportunity to sort of practice the skills that go into a lit review as well. So we're really going to focus on one specific topic, and we're going to look at it from a number of different angles and then use that as a way to prepare to do the same with your POP. Before I do that, just a couple of reminders. If you're doing the journal article, that means you're collecting data in your classroom and not just simply reviewing research. You have a assignment due in November 1st. It's part of your literature review assignment in this case is less to do with getting it right. It's to do with me giving you feedback so you can go collect data as soon as humanly possible. And I just want you to take a look at the screen. This is in the lit review assignment um, for your format. So if you are doing the journal article only, you should do you should download the journal assignment instructions and follow that because your assignment is a little bit different than the one if you're just doing the research review. But if you're doing the journal article, it's due November 1st, not the lit review, but the data design. It shouldn't take you longer than a half an hour to put this together. I just need you to answer these three parts, get it to me, and then I will review and give you feedback as soon as humanly possible so you can get rolling on the data collection. Just a couple of reminders about the literature review. Again, if you haven't seen the introduction to the POP Lit Review presentation, do so immediately. I've noticed that not everyone has checked it out, and you should and need to because it's literally going to walk you through exactly what you need to do the assignment. So it's in Weekly Lessons Module 2, Instruction. There should be a presentation link. And I just want you to know, like, check in with me if you're having issues with actually finding sources or downloading it. You can't find the actual document, or if you're having some issues with language or just the kind of document you're reviewing, just let me know. And then again, this is due on Sunday, November 13th. I would strongly recommend that by Friday, November 5th, that you have your sources in place. You're going to want to spend more time reading them than searching them. Okay, I want to set up the topic that's going to be the focus of Module 3 because it's going to be on text complexity, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with because it's embedded in the Common Core and you've probably gotten professional development on it. You've probably heard your principal or other people in your school talk about it. So I want to point out that Common Core didn't come out of nowhere and it isn't a surprise or flash in the pan. It's part of a long history of sudden reforms or sudden movements or sudden calls for change. And I show one of what is many. Nation at Risk is a good example of one that happened in the 1980s that in a lot of ways precipitated some of the literacy instruction practices you've come to expect and accept. No Child Left Behind is another example of that, the Bush era reforms, just as the standards era during the Clinton presidency issued decrees and mandates that are still influencing us now. But really, the history starts in the early 80s, and I'll talk a little bit about the prehistory of that in a second, of where we're at and just in terms of trying to build towards this idea of what schooling should be in 2016. So let me talk about one of the things that precipitated a nation at risk. And it was a study done by this woman, Betty Durkin, in 1979. And what she did was she went into hundreds of elementary literacy classrooms. And she basically coded every single minute of instruction she observed and gave it different classifications. And what she found was, and these are classifications that could be things like students were reading independently at their desk, or students were working in groups, or in this case, comprehension instruction would be teachers showing students how to read for understanding. Right? So you think about things like strategy instruction, modeling, craft lessons. That's what she means by comprehension instruction. So you can see in the 4,500 minutes of reading instruction that she observed, she coded only 28 minutes, that's less than 1%, that where the teacher was actually teaching kids how to comprehend texts. And this was sort of like this landmark study that kind of exposed well, it was a set of teaching practices that didn't really involve teaching. And the repercussions of this are pretty significant. It really was sort of a massive change to literacy instruction and begat a lot of what we know today, particularly the whole idea of skills instruction. This actually launched that idea. So I note that because it all ties back to this idea very early on in Module 1 that we read about, where Alverman and Moji said that the reforms or ideas about improving comprehension have mostly been around the reader. And the result of that actually comes from this study that was done before, right? And it comes from this idea about this cognitive era. And that is, if you think about the kinds of things that you're used to, are familiar in your schools, think about the idea of the just right book, that we're leveling what text students read based on their individual reading level. Think about the teaching piece. Again, this whole idea about strategy skills instruction, that you're teaching kids some sort of cognitive like process that they're going to like embed or memorize and then be able to enact and transfer really to another text. And then also think about how you're organizing learning in classrooms and how you typically see learning being organized. And I just put an example here. It's not a great one, of course. I'm not advocating for it. But high, medium, low grouping is a really good example about how we're thinking very much about the reader level and reader capacity as when we're forming small groups or guided reading instruction. All those things came out of this idea that we weren't actually attending really carefully to readers and what we were teaching them how to do with text. So that went on for like a good 25, 30 years. That was the paradigm. Many of you either were trained in it or are familiar with it. And so the Common Core comes along, and I want to talk a bit about the base of the research in the Common Core, because it starts with this idea, a couple of ideas, and then it builds on some of the research that we've read. One is that this idea of there was this disconnect between what counted as reading in K through 12 and what counted as reading in college and career, right? One I'm sure you heard of is that there was an overemphasis on narrative in K through 12, whereas there was a much more significant emphasis on expository writing and nonfiction informational texts in college and career. So, and then when you read Appendix A, you'll see they'll note that there was this text complexity difference between college and K-12 texts, so much so that people were coming in and needing so much remedial support because they didn't have access to these pieces. And then there also wasn't a staircase that wasn't building students' capacity to read complex text. So another issue was with the fact that there were just too many standards. And if you look at the old Illinois standards, there were a lot of process standards about what like kids would do, but not as many on like what they would actually comprehend. And then also, they were worried that the connection to that was that in teaching practices, that teachers were focusing a great deal on setting up students to read a text, all that before reading activity, all of that prior knowledge building, but that they weren't spending enough time helping students read independently and be able to read across text on their own, across contents as well. So there's a sort of set of beliefs that underlying the Common Core as a result of that. One was this idea that complex text indicated a readiness, or the ability to read a complex text indicated their readiness for college and career, right? So if you could read and understand a text that had an advanced language or advanced syntax, you then were capable of moving into other environments in which those kinds of texts were important. The other things that we were really focused on was like this idea about knowledge, and there's two pieces. One is word knowledge, and one is background, prior knowledge about stuff, right? And the research guiding the Common Core writers was that both of those things are strongly correlated to comprehension, right? So the swing back away from context and culture to like, what do you actually know? What do you deeply understand? Another piece was this idea about fluency and coherence as being critical to reading complex texts. And coherence ties into this idea about this system integration model, and that is you can create this sort of coherent representation of the text as you read it, right? So you're an active reader, and that you're also a really structured, intentional reader as well. And then there was also pushback to this Just Right Books piece, right? As so they were going on this research that said that leveled readers stultified or impeded student reading growth, whereas the Common Core writers felt that all students should have access to complex text and then some necessary supports in order to help them get it. So that's how we get this idea about text complexity, right? And so I put the definition by the Common Core standards down here. But really, this idea of that texts are a couple of things in terms of language and syntax, in terms of the depth of their meaning, and then also in terms of the context and use of those texts. So when we turn to the readings here, the guiding question you should use to help you think about these readings, particularly how they compare and contrast, is what really or most matters when it comes to helping students read or comprehend complex texts. So I've given you 6 texts that have been written in this sort of Common Core era. Some of them were written this year, in fact. And some of them came out of the immediate text complexity emergence and issue, and some of them are kind of responses to it in terms of how to move forward with it. So you might think about the first 3 as kind of discussions of what it means, the text complexity piece, and what research is behind it. And really the 3 second pieces, the 3 other pieces, Valencia through Fitzgerald, Ford Connors, are really about how to attend to text complexity matters, what really matters in those pieces. So one way to think about this question of answering what matters is, let me give you what seems to be the debate among what matters. Is on one hand, there's this idea of the text now being the predominant piece. Remember, I brought this up in the class discussion, that in the early days of reading research, the text foregrounded everything. The text contained the meaning. What was most important was that students unlocked the meaning inside the text. And so for some people, the Common Core represents a return to this text-centric perspective. The question about whether the text holds the meaning or not is another debate, but this idea of doing close reading of text allows students to deeply understand what a text is saying and means, and then possibly also then critiquing it as well. So much more outsized role of the content than compared to the context activity or the reader. But you're going to see in the text there's another idea here that really connects back to this whole idea about the situation integration model that we looked at in Module 2, and that is this idea that the text and the reader are in this very complex and iterative interaction. And what we're really most interested in is how the reader and the text interact through content. Again, not to say that context activity don't matter, but they're not prioritized inside the Common Core. What really matters is the reader and the text. And so what you're going to see some people try to do is figure out what is that relationship, or what role does the task, the activity play in affecting those pieces. So just some reminders here about due dates. Reading Response 5, which is just a synthesis of the 6 readings, is due the end of the day on Saturday, November 5th. The group task is due November 11th. There is no class discussion for this module, and the lit review is going to be due November 13th. Also, conferences next Saturday. I'm going to, that should be Saturday, November 5th, my bad. They're going to be held either virtually or in person. Email me, schedule one, and we'll figure out what works best for you, whether you want to meet me in a coffee shop or you want to do it via Skype.